Folks, I think we can all agree that terrorism is a bad thing. At least, I hope we can all agree on that. Thus, taking a stand against terrorism must be a good thing, right? Unfortunately, the same laws that America uses to protect our country are often abused to execute a variety of alternative agendas. And it can be argued that these laws were drafted to accomplish just that. The Espionage Act and the Patriot Act are two examples of laws that cast too wide a net, at least in my opinion, silencing dissent, stifling free speech, and criminalizing anyone who dares to question American foreign policy. And the sad reality is that these overreaching laws aren't limited to just the United States. The United Kingdom has its own shameful history of persecuting citizens in the name of fighting terrorism. Let me begin by telling you a story, one that perfectly encapsulates the war being waged on free speech, a war that governments across the world, including so-called Western democracies, have declared against the truth tellers of our society. This is the story of Richard Medhurst, a Syrian-British independent journalist, and how he became a target of the UK government's draconian anti-terrorism laws, all because he dared to challenge the official narrative. Last month, Medhurst was arrested at London Heathrow Airport under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act of 2000. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what heinous crime did he commit? What dark plot was he involved in? Well, the answer is as absurd as it is frightening. His crime was allegedly, and I quote, expressing an opinion or belief that is supportive of a prescribed organization, end quote. But what the hell does that even mean? The truth is, Medhurst's real crime was defending Palestinians' right to resist Israeli apartheid and occupation, advocating for international law and justice in the face of the world's silence. Medhurst has been a vocal critic of the United States, the British, and Israeli war crimes in the Middle East. His advocacy for Julian Assange, who exposed U.S. war crimes through WikiLeaks, and his relentless critique of Western imperialism have made him, frankly, a thorn in the side of the establishment. Under the guise of anti-terrorism, laws like Section 12 serve as legal dragnets meant to silence dissent and suppress freedom of speech. Now, introduced by Tony Blair's Labour government, this law criminalizes anyone who expresses support for an organization deemed terrorist by the state. This, of course, includes organizations like Hamas, which, although its military wing was proscribed in 2001, was banned in its entirety in 2021. The banning of Hamas wasn't just about silencing support for its military actions. It was a move aimed at criminalizing any solidarity with the Palestinian people. And let's be real here, these laws aren't just about security. They're about one thing, control. They're about crushing anyone who dares to challenge the status quo, especially when that status quo involves Western governments' complicity in the ongoing genocide of Palestinians or Iraqis or what have you. And don't take my word for it, look at the numbers. Israel's 320-day assault on Gaza has already killed over 40,000 Palestinians, wounded 90,000 others, and pushed hundreds of thousands to the brink of starvation. The International Court of Justice is currently investigating Israel for genocide. And yet speaking out against these atrocities in Britain can get you arrested, detained, and treated like a criminal. And it doesn't even matter what side of the fence you fall on a Palestine-Israel conflict. Merely speaking out can get you arrested, detained, and treated like a criminal. Medhurst, in fact, was handcuffed, searched, thrown into solitary confinement, and stripped of his phone and work equipment. He spent almost 24 hours in detention, denied contact with his family or friends. And in fact, he was detained for a full 15 hours before detectives even spoke with him. Ultimately, Medhurst was released on bail and is now awaiting official charges. The entire process, he said, was designed to humiliate and intimidate, to rattle him psychologically. Friends, this isn't law enforcement. This is political persecution, and frankly, a form of terrorism in its own right. Medhurst's story is not, of course, unique. He is not the first journalist to be targeted in the United Kingdom for speaking truth to power, and unfortunately, if we're honest, he won't be the last. We live in a world where journalism, the supposed fourth estate, has increasingly become a high-risk profession. Those who choose to peel back the layers of state secrecy, who expose the dirty dealings and war crimes and covert operations of powerful governments, are systematically harassed, criminalized, and silenced. And it's not just happening in authoritarian regimes. This is the reality in democracies that claim to uphold freedom of the press. The stories of Julian Assange, Craig Murray, Kit Klarenberg, and the late David Miranda are prime examples of this disturbing trend. Let's quickly start with Julian Assange, a name synonymous with the fight for press freedom in the 21st century. Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, was responsible for some of the most significant leaks of classified information in modern history. The 2010 release of the Collateral Murder video, which exposed U.S. war crimes in Iraq, sent shockwaves around the world. WikiLeaks also published a trove of U.S. diplomatic cables, the Iraq and Afghan war logs, and information on the Guantanamo Bay detainees. These documents laid bare the ugly underbelly of U.S. foreign policy, showing the extent of civilian casualties, torture, and deceit that had been concealed from the public eye. And what was Julian's reward for this service to transparency and accountability? He was relentlessly pursued by the U.S. government, which slapped him with charges under the Espionage Act, charges that could see him in prison for up to 175 years if he were to be extradited from the United Kingdom. For nearly a decade, Assange sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, fearing that he would be extradited to the United States to face what would essentially be a death sentence. During his time in the embassy, he was spied on, isolated, and denied medical care. His attorneys were spied on, their documents gone through as they left the Ecuadorian embassy. And when Ecuador revoked his asylum, Julian was dragged out of the embassy by British police and has since languished in Belmarsh prison, awaiting his fate. Now, fortunately, the U.S. dropped most of those charges, and Julian has been released and is now back home in Australia. But during his time in prison, his health deteriorated, and he was subjected to conditions that amount to psychological torture. And this is not an opinion. This is according to the United Nations Special Report on Torture, Niles Meltzer. But Julian Assange is certainly not alone being targeted for exposing uncomfortable truth. Take Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, turned whistleblower. Murray blew the whistle on the use of torture in the so-called war on terror, revealing that intelligence obtained through torture was being shared between Uzbekistan and Western governments, including the United Kingdom. He refused to remain silent about the UK government's complicity in human rights abuses. And as a result, he was, of course, sidelined, harassed, and eventually dismissed from his post. Murray, of course, has also been a vocal supporter of Julian Assange and a critic of the UK's justice system, especially its treatment of whistleblowers and journalists. For his efforts, he too became a target of the state. In 2021, Murray was convicted of contempt of court for his reporting on the trial of former Scottish First Minister Alex Salmond. He was sentenced to 8 months in prison, a move that many saw as politically motivated, aimed at silencing one of the most prominent defenders of Assange and a staunch critic of the UK establishment. Murray's conviction was a chilling reminder that even in so-called liberal democracies, journalists who challenge the official narrative are simply not safe. And then there's Kit Klarenberg, a journalist for The Gray Zone, an independent outlet that has been a thorn in the side of Western governments for its investigative reporting on U.S. and UK foreign policy. Klarenberg was detained at the UK border in 2022 while returning from a reporting trip. His phones and electronic devices were also seized, and he was interrogated for hours by counterterrorism officers. So again, we ask, well, what was his crime? His crime? Investigating the activities of Western intelligence agencies and their role in manipulating public opinion. Klarenberg's detention was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of harassment aimed against the Gray Zone. The outlet's editor, Max Blumenthal, and other journalists associated with it have faced similar forms of intimidation. The Gray Zone has been smeared in the media, falsely labeled as purveyors of disinformation and conspiracy theories, and targeted by several social media censorship campaigns. All of this because they refuse to toe the line when it comes to US and UK foreign policy. And let's not forget David Miranda, a Brazilian politician and journalist who tragically passed away in 2023. Miranda was the husband and partner of Glenn Greenwald, the journalist who worked with Edward Snowden to expose the vast surveillance apparatus of the U.S. National Security Agency. In 2013, Miranda was detained at London's Heathrow Airport under the UK's Terrorism Act while en route from Berlin to Rio de Janeiro. He was held for 9 hours, the maximum amount of time permitted under the law, and his electronic devices were confiscated. Miranda was not a terrorist. He was a journalist carrying sensitive information related directly to the Snowden leaks. Yet he was being treated like a common criminal, all because he was engaged in one of the most important journalistic endeavors of our time, exposing the extent of government surveillance on its own citizens. These cases are not aberrations. They are part of a deliberate strategy by governments to chill dissent, intimidate journalists, and suppress the free flow of information. The message is clear. If you challenge state power, if you expose its crimes, if you refuse to play by its rules, you will be targeted. You will be harassed, detained, prosecuted, and potentially jailed. And again, this is not happening in faraway authoritarian regimes. It's happening in countries that claim to be bastions of democracy and free speech, like the United States and the United Kingdom. The United States, the United Kingdom, and their allies wrap themselves in the rhetoric of freedom, democracy, and human rights. But their actions tell quite a different story. When the state can use laws like the Espionage Act, the Patriot Act, or the UK's Terrorism Act to silence dissent and suppress journalism, then these lofty ideals become nothing more than empty slogans. They mean absolutely nothing. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech. These are hollow words when reporters are being dragged off planes and locked up for challenging state-sanctioned violence. And this crackdown on journalism is part of a larger pattern of escalating authoritarianism in the West. Anti-terrorism laws, surveillance programs, and so-called national security measures are being weaponized against anyone who dares to question the state. In the United States, the Department of Justice has used the Espionage Act to prosecute whistleblowers and journalists alike. Edward Snowden remains in exile for exposing the NSA's illegal surveillance programs. Chelsea Manning was imprisoned for years for leaking classified documents that exposed war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Reality Winner, an NSA contractor, was sentenced to over 5 years in prison for leaking a report on Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election. Imagine that. The list just goes on. We are witnessing the gradual erosion of press freedom and civil liberties in the name of national security. And it's happening in countries that pride themselves on being free. If we don't push back against this assault on our fundamental rights, if we don't stand up for the journalists and whistleblowers who risk everything to bring us the truth, then we risk losing these rights all together. Richard Medhurst's story is just one chapter in this ongoing saga of repression. It's a warning to all of us. If we continue down this path, we will wake up one day to find that the truth has been buried under layers of state secrecy. And to those who dare to dig it up, are left to rot in prison cells. If we allow governments to criminalize dissent, to silence journalists, to intimidate and harass those who expose their crimes, then we are complicit in the destruction of the very freedoms we ourselves claim to cherish. Let me ask you this. Can we really call ourselves democracies when our government treats journalists like terrorists? When those who expose war crimes are the ones being thrown into cells while the perpetrators of those crimes walk free? The real terrorists here are the states that use these draconian laws to suppress dissent and perpetuate injustice. The real threat to our freedom isn't some faraway enemy. It's the very governments that claim to protect us while stripping us of our most basic rights. We need to stand up against these abuses. We need to defend the Richard Medhurst of the world. Because if we don't, the freedom to speak out, to tell the truth, to resist injustice will disappear, not with a bang, but with a quiet click of handcuffs in an airport somewhere near you. And that is the final word up front. I'm Sean Sainhart. This is Crusade America, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Crusade America. Today we have the pleasure of hosting a distinguished guest whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of American history and its intersections with contemporary issues. Joining us is Matthew Warshauer, a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University and an acclaimed author. His latest book, Creating and Failing the 9/11 Generation, delves into the complexities and challenges faced by the generation that came of age during the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. Matthew is no stranger to exploring pivotal moments in U.S. history. His previous works include Andrew Jackson and the Politics of Martial Law, Andrew Jackson in Context, Connecticut and the American Civil War, and Inside Connecticut and the Civil War. Beyond his books, he has contributed numerous articles, book chapters, and essays that deepen our understanding of historical events and their lasting impacts. Matthew's insights are not just academic, they are a crucial lens through which we can examine the present by understanding the past. And we are honored to have him here today to discuss his work and the broader implications it holds for our society. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Sean. I really appreciate you having me.
It was my pleasure. So as I mentioned earlier, before the show, huge fan of the book. I have to admit, it was a hard book to read in terms of, it was a very easy read, but hard in terms of the substance that was presented.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wonder if you could maybe, well, here, let me start with this. The term 9/11 generation is quite central to your book. Could you maybe elaborate on what defines this generation and how their experiences and worldviews have been shaped by the events of 9/11 and its aftermath?
Well, so let me begin. Thank you for that. Let me begin by saying that the 9/11 generation is what we proverbially call Gen Z. One of my big arguments is they're not Gen Z. They are distinctly shaped by the events of 9/11. There's two halves to the generation: the direct generation, which remember it. It's some of their earliest memories, and it shaped their lives in definite ways. And then there's the indirect generation, those who were born after the event or don't remember it, who were nevertheless caught up in the cultural wake of 9/11. And I believe that we're still in the midst of the cultural wake of 9/11. So if I had to choose one way to describe this generation, it's quite simply chaos. They have experienced in their lifetimes the 21st century started out terribly because of 9/11 and got even worse because of the way the United States government responded to it. So it's chaos. That's the hallmark of the generation.
You mentioned the alienation and fear experienced by young people today that can be traced back to 9/11. How do you see these emotions sort of manifesting in the current behavior and attitudes of the 9/11 generation?
I think for a long time it was, and still continued, it is just a distrust, a sincere and severe distrust of government, and the belief that our government is just completely and utterly dysfunctional. I was talking with a group of students about that just yesterday. Today is the first week of classes at Central Connecticut State University, and I asked the students, 40 kids in the class, I said, how many of you think that government is functional? And not one kid in the class raised their hand. And so it's this sense of dysfunction. But what's been really fascinating to me over the last really about 4 years or so is that this generation, it's the back half of the 9/11 generation, they are on the rise. They are in movement. I feel like the millennials in the first half of the 9/11 generation were sort of, I've described it as being hit in the head with a mallet. And they just sort of sat there, sort of dumbfounded. And, there were no major on-campus protests against the Iraq War, even though there were the world's largest protests against war in the history of the world. Yet on college campuses, they were incredibly quiet. And I remember, I'll never forget it. Most of my colleagues who were in the process of just getting ready to retire at that time in 2003, they had started their careers at the beginning of the Vietnam era, when the anti-war movement was centered on the college campuses. And so the front half of this generation, the millennials, were incredibly quiet. But the back half of the generation has suddenly become very, very active. And we first saw it with the Parkland students, the kids who organized the March for Our Lives rallies. Then we saw it in the Me Too movement. Then it moved into Black Lives Matter. And now it's these mass college movements against Israel and the Israeli policy in regards to Palestinians. And, I think about what you were saying with the start of the show about, weaponizing protests. Well, what has been happening on our college campuses with new policies, sit-ins getting shut down, new policies, curbing the ability of students to act out. But, these movements, these student and youth movements have given me a lot of hope for democracy in action and free speech.
Yeah, I share your optimism in that respect, but I have to say that I felt this way before 9/11, this dysfunctionality of our government. And I guess we should even start here. And you mentioned one of the things that I love about your book is that you don't try to throw shade on the U.S. government. You expose the U.S. government in saying that a lot of the aftermath of 9/11 was unnecessary. For instance, and again, we can argue the specifics, but the U.S. Patriot Act, for instance, was largely unnecessary because the government had all the information it needed to stop 9/11. Would that be fair to say?
I think they had all the information they needed. And certainly, I mean, the key thing in regards to the Patriot Act is that this was a surprise attack, right? It caught us unaware. So let's say that they really didn't put the pieces together, which I question. But the fact that it was a surprise attack, that kind of an attack would never work again. Therefore, why did they need this massive increase of surveillance, policy? And what plenty of people besides me have said. I mean, what they got in the Patriot Act was a grab bag of things that the FBI and the Justice Department had wanted for years and years and years.
Yes.
And 9/11 provided the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, it provided a lot of opportunities, I think. And you lay this out in your book, too. I mean, the Iraq War, for instance, I mean, that was something that was really in the works prior to 9/11. 9/11 just provided an opportunity for that to happen. Going back to my last question. So my sense of dysfunction of the U.S. government has been almost through my entire life. What do you think was significant about 9/11 that it really was it the fact that 9/11 happened, or was it what we did in the aftermath that really woke people up, in your opinion? Like you said, the indirect 9/11 generation.
I think it was what the United States government did in the aftermath. And, I agree with you that there has been dysfunction in American government. There's always been dysfunction in American government, right? I mean, we are a democracy, and democracies are notoriously messy. And in some ways, they're supposed to be messy. We're not supposed to be able to pass things quickly and easily. And there's always going to be a certain degree of dissent. It's the difficulty of majoritarian democracy, where you have, it could be somebody could win, or a party could win by a tiny, tiny sliver of the majority. And what does that do to the minority and their rights and their views? That's one of the struggles of representative government that existed since the very beginning. But I think when you look at the 1990s, the aftermath of the Cold War, the rise of the dot-com era, this just booming economy that existed, a sense that there was some optimism in the world that perhaps we were going to move to, utopia is a little grand of a term to use, but at least a better time, an opportunity for the nation to function in a way that some had hoped the world would function in the aftermath of World War II. And, there was real hope there. Of course, we can go into, and this is one of the real problems of the dysfunction, the 1990s is also the rise of the Newt Gingrich Republican Party, which creates real venom and a poison into our political system that we are now seeing fully revealed in the rise of Donald Trump. He is the result of that Gingrich plan. But I still think that there was still this sense of hope and optimism. We felt like we were on the rise. And then 9/11 happens. And my argument has been that, and I write this in the book, is that the Twin Towers fell across the road to the 21st century. And we had options. We could go around one way, which would be might makes right. And you're either with us or against us. And if you don't act, we will. And if you're not with us, you're with the terrorists. That's the path that we chose. Or we could act with a movement of that this is a criminal justice issue,
right?
With an element of military to it, that we are going to embrace the world reaching out to us. And I'm talking about not just our NATO and our traditional allies, but Russia reached out to us, China reached out to us, Iran reached out to us. This was the 1990s, and 9/11 was the greatest opportunity to settle matters with Iran that we've ever had since 1953, and to help a burgeoning moderate movement within the Iranian government to gain a foothold. And when George W. Bush, I've been asked, when does the patriotism of 9/11 end? And I always say, I'll give you the exact date. It ended on January 29th, 2002. Because that was the date of George W. Bush's State of the Union address, which is known as the Axis of Evil speech, in which he called out Iran, North Korea, and Iraq. And he signaled to nations across the world that we were going to invade Iraq. And now everybody, even Republicans, say, oh, geez, Iraq was a real mistake. We knew at the time that Iraq was a mistake. Yeah. And that's where the true chaos comes from. That's the result of nations around the world looking at us in a very different way, and really American citizens and people around the world questioning whether or not the United States is on the side of good.
Yeah. And I would argue, and we'll get to this in a bit too, I would argue that we're not on the side of good. I mean, if we look at 9/11, your book makes the point, a lot of people, or George Bush in particular, made an issue that they attacked us on 9/11 because they hate our freedoms. Well, that's not entirely true.
Not true at all. Not entirely true. It's not true. They hate our foreign policy.
Exactly. And they should hate our foreign policy.
Yes, they should.
What really led up to, because a lot of people don't recognize bin Laden, as you put in your book, was actually an intelligent, charismatic leader. Murderer, yes. Terrorist, yes. But he was not this buffoon that we've made him out to be in the media and in just the social sphere that we live in. He had a list of legitimate grievances against the United States. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to those to kind of give a broader context of what led to 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, so many Americans think that bin Laden is just this sort of goat-herding troglodyte who lives in a cave, and he just got lucky against the greatest security apparatus in the world. And nothing could be further from the truth. What he did was awful, but it was his planning for this was brilliant and incredibly effective. And what always strikes me is, when I spent a tremendous amount of time really digging through bin Laden's writings, not just the Declaration of Jihad from 1996, but from many of his other writings. And he's tremendously consistent throughout all of these writings. And I spent a lot of time looking at George W. Bush's writings and his speeches, and his continual argument, and informing the American people that this is good versus evil, that this is about justice and protecting freedom, and that he hates our freedom. This 9/11 generation has been raised on the very idea of good versus evil. That's the way to view the world. That's one of the hallmarks of the generation. And I remember reading Bush's commencement address for West Point a few years after 9/11. And in the address, he says, it's not like they gave us a list of grievances. And I laughed and said, no, actually, they gave you a list of grievances. And it was like 22 pages, single spaced. And they issued it throughout the world for you to look at. And you didn't pay any attention to it. And most Americans didn't pay any attention to it. And in that document, the Declaration of Jihad, and I have my students read it, and they are astounded by it, by how lucid it is, how cogent it is, how consistent it is. And my students actually feel uncomfortable after they've read it, because they feel like, well, it sounds like he had some reasonable arguments to make here. And as a result of that, they feel actually unpatriotic, as though I shouldn't be agreeing with this guy. And I'm like, all right, let's separate your love for your country from wanting your country to do better, because I think that that's what true patriotism is. And so we have a really robust conversation. And I ask the students in their midterm exam, I say, write an essay in which you argue the three most important things you think you've learned from this class so far. And one of the responses is almost universally, the Declaration of Jihad blew my mind. I couldn't believe it. They think the way that you described it, Sean, that he's just this cave dweller.
Yeah.
And I'll finish with this kind of component of it. When Michael Shower, the CIA bin Laden chief, read the Declaration of Jihad, he got scared, because everybody in these bin Laden units had thought that bin Laden was just a money mover, that he was just a sort of sideline guy, that he wasn't one of the major ideologues and leaders. And as soon as Shower read this, he went, oh my God, this guy is an effective polemicist. He knows how to argue, and argue based on history and effectively. And yeah, bin Laden is, I think, a fascinating and very underrated figure in American and world history.
No, absolutely. And what were some of his grievances?
I mean, his primary grievances are that the United States is occupying the land of the two holiest places in the history of Islam. Both of those are in Saudi Arabia. They are Mecca and Medina. If you remember that in the 1990s, the United States, in the first Gulf War, we sent troops over to Saudi Arabia to oust Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The king of Saudi Arabia passed, that one of the emirs passed special edicts to allow non-Muslim troops to be on Muslim soil, and the king had promised that they would be gone shortly. And bin Laden says, we now know that that's not the case. There are still troops in Saudi Arabia 6-7 years later, and he's got a major problem with that. His other major complaint was about the Crusader Zionist alliance that was against Muslims, and that Muslim blood was treated as the cheapest in the world. And of course, he's talking about the establishment of Israel and the U.S. support for Israel. And we see this played out every day in our news cycle now, ever since the October 7th attack. And of course, does Israel have a right to exist? I think the answer is yes. Do they have a right to defend themselves? I think the answer is yes. But the question becomes, to what extent? Just like the U.S. response in the aftermath of 9/11, we have 3,000 of our citizens killed. Overall in the wars, there's 9,000 Americans who die, overseas. Mm-hmm. How many people from the Middle East die as a result of our response? We're into the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands. You started in your intro, 1,500 Israelis killed or kidnapped, 40,000 Palestinians now dead. That response just seems to me and many others to be unreasonable.
Yes.
And so bin Laden, I think, has very, very cogent arguments to be made, and they're all about American foreign policy. And one of the things he says that I think is most revealing. He writes, and it's written for, like our Declaration of Independence. It's written for his own people. It's written for the United States. It's written for the rest of the world to listen to what we're saying here, our grievance. He says, I don't want to be violent, but you've closed off every recourse that I have, and I must do something. I can't do nothing. And he says, it is only the coward who allows you to walk on our soil with his uniform and his arms in hand, right? And I would often ask my students, what would happen if Mexico sent a contingent of soldiers to Texas to control the American side of the border? How do you think that would go, right? And, I think we need to look at these things with a little bit of reason and logic and think about how we project our power in the world.
Yeah, I agree 100%. A lot of it is rooted in the expansion of capitalism and in the name of imperialism. Let's face it, Iraq was really about the oil.
I think Iraq was about oil, unquestionably, but I think Iraq was also very much about extending American power and having having bases in the heart of the Middle East. And the craziest component of all of this, to me, and I discuss this quite a bit in the book, is the fact that the Bush administration, Rumsfeld with his new high-tech military working in smaller numbers and at lightning speed, I think they really believed that the neocons really believed that this was going to be a cakewalk. That's the word they used, that they were going to just waltz into the heart of the Middle East, overthrow Saddam Hussein, establish a functioning democracy, replace a socialist economic system with a capitalist economic system. The Economist once ran an article about this called "The Great Iraqi Yard Sale," and it just the level of cultural stupidity and the level of arrogance to believe that this is the way that things was going to work it's dumbfounding.
Yeah. No, and again, you talk in the book about how the Iraq War fundamentally changed international relations and created a lot of this widespread instability.
The chaos that we see in the world right now, from refugee crisis to far-right nationalist, xenophobic governments all throughout Europe and other parts of the world, every bit of it is the aftershock of 9/11 and the U.S. response. You want to know why Brexit was voted on and the EU was pulled, or the England pulled out of the EU? It's because of this. When Ukraine was invaded, I watched journalists talking about, the refugee crisis over the border into Poland. They're saying, oh, this is the largest refugee crisis since the World War II. And I just looked at it. I was like, you have no idea what you're talking about. The largest refugee crisis since World War II has been the crisis of refugees fleeing from the Middle East and landing all throughout the Mediterranean, all throughout Europe. And I think when they first start arriving, the natural thought is, oh my God, these poor refugees, let us see what we can do to help these poor people who are, struggling from displacement and war. But the longer that goes on, the less capacity people have. And then you start getting the othering of people, and you get the subcultures of Muslim culture. They're naturally going to congregate in neighborhoods where they feel safer in their language and their culture. And you get a reaction to that. And that reaction is othering and xenophobia and the rise of the radical right in many, many places, including in the United States.
Oh, especially in the United States.
Yeah. The 9/11 in many ways was a gift to the radical right in the United States.
Explain that.
Well, it allowed them to come out of the shadows, to make very, very distinct arguments about the need to protect America from the other, right? To start arming, to start preparing. The Patriot Act, we think of the Patriot Act as causing distress among some American citizens because of the concern of surveillance over foreign terrorism. But it also allows the government to surveil people in terms of domestic terrorism.
Yes.
And the right looks at that and they go, overreach of government. And they start preparing. So again, the outgrowth of all of this is pretty significant. And then you also have to think about it in terms of the sort of the psychological and cultural and political displacement of many of our troops who go overseas, who are fighting. The phrase that I use in the book was by an author named Phil Clay, who I absolutely love his work. He wrote a great book called Redeployment, which, if you're interested in the impact on soldiers, it's just a fantastic book. And he wrote a piece where he said, we went to war while America went to the mall. So you get all these soldiers coming home from fighting in the Middle East. They're home in one plane ride, and America doesn't look like it's sacrificing at all for this war effort. And it creates a real dissatisfaction among many, many of the troops. Now, we've trained tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young men and women in the art of guerrilla warfare and insurgency. And then we sent them home, and they're discontent with the government at home, and they start using that training against us. It's not a surprise to me that when January 6th happened, there were plenty of both active and retired military people who were involved in that event. So we've created, in some sense, a bit of a ticking time bomb here.
I would agree. And to what end do you think this is going to sort of evolve? I mean, we have an election coming up that's still, for the most part, 50-50.
Yeah.
And I think your argument here is very compelling, because I often hear from people, how did this happen? How did Trump happen? How did the far right happen? And to link it back to 9/11, I think makes a very compelling argument that you laid out very precisely in your book. And while I'm talking about the book, can we go ahead and put the book up on the screen so people can Creating and Failing the 9/11 Generation, the Real Story of September 11th.
And if people are interested in looking in the book, you can go to my website, which is themindfulprofessor.org. Themindfulprofessor.org. You can read the introduction, you can look at the table of contents, and take a look at what's in the book.
And again, I encourage people, this is not this is not a book that's just about 9/11. This is a book that is about our society as it exists today. And it explains why the society that we have exists today. And so I guess I would argue that if we're going to surpass any of this, if we're going to get to better times, we first have to understand how we got here.
That's it exactly, Sean. That's it exactly. I've described to my students many times, how many of us as individuals have experienced some sort of trauma in their lives that as we move forward, it might even be decades later, that it continues to impact us in some way. And ultimately, what do we do to resolve those difficulties? Well, many of us go to counselors or therapists. And what do those counselors and therapists do? They bring us back to the moment of that trauma, and they explore it, and they explore what happened, why it happened, and how we reacted to it, and what we can do to change patterns so we don't keep repeating. That's what this book is about. That's what the purpose of this book is. So I say in the intro to the book that this book is about the 9/11 generation, but it's also for the 9/11 generation, because I want them to learn these lessons so we can get out of this cycle of chaos that we're in. That's really the major point of the book.
Yeah, and again, I think you made the arguments very precisely and convincingly, and the evidence is clearly laid out. It's not just this isn't just a theoretical exercise. This is very much an academic work of rigor, and I really appreciate you writing this book. Which leads me to my next question: why did you write the book? What made you decide? Okay, I need to do this.
You know what? That's actually a really interesting story, and there's a very distinct story to it. So my area of expertise is really early national American political history. So the founding of the country, Declaration of Independence to the Civil War, and I wrote a couple of books on Connecticut and the Civil War, and I was the co-chair of the Connecticut's commission to commemorate the Civil War. And in 2011, I was giving a talk. That was the beginning of the sesquicentennial. I was at a site where I was talking to a little over 100 people about meaning and memory in the American Civil War, and I was talking to a room full of people who didn't remember anything. And you have to remember, the American Civil War is as close to the failure of this experiment in American government as we've ever come. For today's number, 750,000 Americans died. If you do that per capita for the population today, we're talking about 7 million people. I mean, the Civil War is 9/11 on steroids. And here I am talking, 150 years later about meaning and memory to a bunch of people who don't know what the meaning of the war is and have no memory of it whatsoever. And while I'm talking, I'm looking out of these huge plate glass windows at this library I'm at, and there's a giant banner across the street that says 9/11, 10th anniversary. We will never forget. And I just thought to myself, you want to make a bet that we'll never forget? And it was that moment. I was at the front end of the commemoration, which I knew was going to last 4 years. And I said, when this commemoration is over, that's my next job. I'm gonna start researching this. And honestly, it has taken me 10 years of teaching and research, and writing and rethinking on this book to get it all done. But I really genuinely believe this is the most important thing I've ever written.
Wow. That's a very powerful statement.
And I'll also tell you the epilogue. You had said it's a difficult book to read because of its content, right? I worked very hard on writing this book. I worked harder to modify my writing voice in this book to make it accessible to anybody who wants to read it. So it's not academic ease and it's not difficult read, but the content is difficult to deal with. And you recognize that. I appreciate that. And I started the epilogue by saying, it's 3 a.m. I'm up again. I'm writing notes hastily on the notes function of my phone. And my wife turns to me and says, half asleep, this book is killing you. And it's true. It was an incredibly emotionally difficult book to write because I don't want to do an injustice or a disrespect to the people who were impacted by 9/11. I don't want to forget the people who died. I don't want to disrespect in any way the first responders who
Right.
gave their lives on behalf of others so selflessly. But in the same token, I need to shed a light on this. And so the subtitle of the book is The Real Story of September 11th. Why that subtitle? Because what most other authors and what most museums, and if you've been to the 9/11 Museum in New York City, where I've been, a dozen times with my students, I went twice a year, every year for years. That museum is all about what I refer to as the 102 minutes. From the time that the first plane struck the North Tower to the time that tower fell. And that is all about what I refer to as the tragedy and triumph narrative of 9/11. That this horrible tragedy befell us, but we were triumphant and resilient, and we're America, and we always get back on our feet. And I think it's a noteworthy and honorable story, but it is definitely not the story of September 11th. It's a fraction of the story of September 11th. The story of September 11th is American foreign policy after World War II and all the way up to today of how our military and our foreign policy is operating.
Absolutely. And you write a lot about too the pervasive distrust of government that has gripped the 9/11 generation in particular. How do you think, and this may seem obvious to many, but how do you think this distrust has influenced political engagement and activism among young people today?
I think it's at the heart of everything. There's so much tremendous distrust. Look, we talked about the social activism of the back half of the 9/11 generation. Those kids at Parkland, after 17 of their friends are killed and 17 are wounded, they sort of wake up and go, "Oh my God, the adults aren't going to do anything. The government isn't going to do anything. We better act ourselves." Me Too movement, same thing. The system has never done anything to protect women. Black Lives Matter. We watch Derek Chauvin extinguish George Floyd's life right on the screen. And the Black Lives Matter. They do these things and they engage in these movements because they have no faith that government will do something unless it's forced to do something. And the Trump era and MAGA has further exacerbated all of this by sowing even more distrust in government. January 6th, a lot of those people who stormed the Capitol building that day believed that they were patriots. And they stormed that Capitol building specifically because Donald Trump told them to do it. Because Donald Trump said, this election was rigged. You can't trust the government. The government is the deep state. You talked a lot in your opening about the press. Those kinds of people have convinced people that you can't trust the media, you can't trust the government. I mean, trust in government is the very foundation of American representative government. It's the foundation. If you lose faith in the government, we're done. And so this coming election, to me, is an existential crisis in government. Kamala Harris personally would not have been my first choice as the Democratic nominee. But to me, this election has come down. It is a single issue election, a single issue. And that is saving democracy and saving the American experiment in government from fascism. It's just that simple. And once we've done that, then we can have a debate about policy and what we should be doing as a country. To me, it's that simple.
Doesn't the policy, though, matter in terms of, for instance, let's say that we elect Kamala Harris. Donald Trump himself may be gone from the picture, but there's going to be someone to step up in his place. And without the policy actions that are necessary, aren't we just ensuring eventually that we keep dealing with this issue over and over again? Because I don't think that the MAGA movement is going to dissipate.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I've been studying the rise and demise of party movements for most of my career. And I have been predicting for the last 7-8 years, the Republican Party is in a process of disintegration. And we've witnessed this happen. The party couldn't have been taken over by Trump and by the MAGAs if it wasn't fundamentally weakened and destabilized from the inside. So, I mean, that to me is very, very clear. And I think what Trump has done by creating and turning it into a cult of personality, as opposed to, not that there aren't policies within the Republican Party, but most of the policies that they put forward run opposite to what the vast majority of Americans want when it comes down, when we look at it in terms of polling. So it really is about a cult of personality. I think when Donald Trump, defeating him now is the most important thing, because there is not somebody else waiting in the wings. Who is going to be the next Republican candidate who can come up and do what Trump has done? Say what you like about Trump, but he's amazingly adept at keying in to people's grievances, and he's got a lot of personality. And I don't see anybody else out there that has the gravitas that he does. What's it going to be, Don Jr.? I don't think so. And so what's going to happen is when Trump loses this election, which I hope he does, the party is going to be left going, now what? And there's a tremendous number of moderate Republicans who have been towing the line because they fear Trump. When Trump is gone, I think you're going to see a lot of big changes happen. And I'm not saying that it's not going to impact the Democratic Party also. Whenever you have a major party realignment, it impacts both parties, not just one party. But I think that the Republican Party is going to, if they lose this election, I think that they are going to be reeling. And they're going to have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out, how do we get back on a better path?
Wow, that is optimistic. Because it just, I mean, given the stakes that we've talked about, and given the politics, especially the end of abortion rights, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, you would think that this election would not even be close to 50-50. But yet here we are. We're still. It just doesn't seem like a movement that's getting close to disintegrating.
Well, I mean, if you look closer into the interior of it, I just read, literally last night, I read a fantastic article in The Atlantic, and it was, I can't remember the exact title, but it was basically why the religious right should abandon Trump. And it was all about abortion and what's actually happening on the ground. The Dobbs decision erased Roe v. Wade, but the reality is more abortions are taking place in the United States than ever before. It's up considerably, even from the time that Obama was president, and that there's a lot of movements in different places to expand women's rights. And so the article was arguing, I think quite effectively, that the way Dobbs has been presented is that the sky is falling, but the reality on the ground is it hasn't been quite as bad as we think, and that's going to create some problems for Trump and for the right. And so I think that when Trump is not able to channel the MAGA movement's grievances, and the Republican Party isn't able to trumpet, do it as effectively, I think there's going to be substantial changes that occur within that party.
Well, I certainly hope so.
Me too.
I'm not confident that even if Trump loses the election, they're going to accept the results of the election. I'm not as concerned that they're not going to accept the results of the election. There may be some that don't accept the results of the election, but I don't think that we're going to see civil war as a result of it. And I think that the federal government is much more prepared to respond if there is violence and problems in the aftermath. Trump chose not to respond at all. I think that that we're going to be much more prepared for that, and I think that he knows, and this has been in the press a lot, that if he doesn't win this election, the likelihood of him going to prison is very high. These other cases in regards to insurrection have not gone away. We know that the Justice Department just filed another charge against Trump, and his get out of jail free card is winning this election. And if that doesn't happen, not only is he going to be tried and I believe found guilty, but all of those people who he's going to pardon that have been convicted, well over 1,000 people, that's not going to happen. And so I think that's going to have a bit of a chilling effect. Well, that is very optimistic. Matthew, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fascinating conversation. Can we put the book back up please? Creating and Failing the 9/11 Generation, The Real Story of September 11th. Matthew, you know what? I'm going to let you say your last name because I can't pronounce it. It's
really actually easy. Warshauer.
I have a speech impediment, and so it's really hard for me to pronounce words.
You're doing fine, John.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it. I could talk to you for hours. I really could. Your book is absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you for writing it. And again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Sean.